So good evening, everybody. Again, my name is Olena, and I'm happy to be here as part of Fatigue Project. It's also an honor to be presenting alongside such renowned researchers. I'm only getting my PhD at the Jagiellonian in Krakow, and I'm researching populism in Poland, as all of us, and my presentation will touch on many of the same aspects as Alexandra's before. I'm researching also like the populist discourse, but more from analyzing it as an ideology and focusing on othering in my dissertation project more on migrants as others, but in this presentation, it's based on a little bit of a side study on peace discourse on LGBT as others. So I will talk about how peace created this very successful right-wing populist narrative by incorporating LGBT people as others into them, thereby also focusing on the supplied side of populism and deconstructing the discourse and trying to analyze it. So yeah, Peace Party needs no introduction, I believe here. You all know it. Far right-wing populist party that has been consistently in power in Poland since 2015. The question is, how did they manage to win all these elections for 5 years straight now? Many academics such as Krzyżanowski and Klaus and others agree that an important factor of Law and Justice's electoral success in 2015, when it first came, second came to power, but first now, was how they managed to utilize in their electoral campaign the so-called European migration crisis that unfolded right before the election. Just as a good illustration of that, you can see on the slide a screenshot from another peace campaign during the local election next year, which used the same message. So they created this fake news report where refugees are flooding Poland because their political opponents, the Civil Platform Party, PO, has been elected. So Law and Justice presented migrants as, quote, an issue of security, both national and cultural, direct and symbolic, according to Klaus, and presented themselves as a messiah that could save Poland, and only they could save Poland from this threat, thereby kind of mobilizing this fear-based support. Which is a typical strategy for right-wing populists. As Kasmuda wrote in 2007, that right-wing populists tend to have many enemies. That is that in their discourse, they construct multiple images of the other with negative and threatening attributes in order to mobilize this fear-based support, which Bruce Wodak, for instance, kind of refers to as the politics of fear, and some scholars call it animization of politics. In this such discourse, particularly in discourse about refugees, according to Klaus, it is usually based on this differentiation, the antagonism of us versus them, where of course us are inherently good and pure and them are bad. And this antagonism is inherent to right-wing populism, where the society is presented as divided into a few kind of clearly defined, symbolically of course, and separated groups. At least so if you view populism as an ideology, which I do. So I take Mude and Kaltwasser's ideational definition of populism, which reads that populism is a sin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic camps. The first one being the pure people, as you can see on the slide, this groups. Versus the corrupt elite, the corrupt elite, which argues that politics should be, not the corrupt elite, but the populism argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, the general will of the people. And in his earlier work, Muda further explains that populism is this Manichaean outlook in which there are only friends and foes, and opponents are not just people with different priorities and values, they're evil. So consequently, there could be no compromise because their purity is corrupt. I taken this approach. I only work with a thick variation of populism, which is this thin-centered ideology thickened, combined with nativism and authoritarianism. Because this allows to analyze populism in this triad. So apart from the corrupt elites and the pure people, there are also aliens or enemies. So, and the corrupt elites, they usually exacerbate the danger or the threat that the enemies pose. And these enemies or aliens, they can be internal, such as different minorities, LGBT for instance, or external, such as migrants, or even very kind of abstract as an ideology. So as we see, enemy making is an inherent part of right-wing populism, as the pure people have enemies kind of both on horizontal and on vertical axis, above and beyond. And all these groups are constructed through discourse, yes, through discursive maneuvers, which give them kind of, which construct the symbolic boundaries and which fill the groups with specific cultural substances. In my paper, I try to kind of deconstruct this triad for the Polish case and define these boundaries and substances, which I did using critical discourse analysis, as it specifically allows to kind of critically examine the use of language to explore social issues. And yeah, my material was the official discourse of peace from their website, but also from Twitter and from Twitter of their 14 prominent members. So during this critical discourse analysis, I, in my research, tried to uncover nomination, predication, and legitimization strategies that Law and Justice uses in regard to discursive othering of LGBT poles. So I start with nomination strategies, which is how the others, in this case, LGBT people, are referred to. And you can see some examples on the slide. Of course, the most kind of famous and vivid term that was already mentioned by Alexandra is the rainbow plague, which was not coined by Peace. It was coined by the Archbishop of Krakow, but it was in Twitter repeatedly repeated by Law and Justice members. And from this table, you can notice that all this derogatory ideologanism, so the sick ideology, the plague, the leftist avalanche, when they talk about kind of LGBT movement, like they are attacking the movement, the ideology, but the attack is not personalized to the people per se. So, I mean, I don't want to, call the words, but you could imagine that from kind of homophobic people, there could be very personalized slurs that could be used, which they don't. Rather, this kind of, the very idea of LGBT is being attacked rather than the people per se. So this research for this was done based on the discourse prior to the European election in 2009, when they first mobilized this anti-LGBT rhetoric. And then came the presidential race of 2020, where unfortunately I got more proof for this claim that peace dehumanizes LGBT people and LGBT activism by framing them as an ideology, particularly a foreign one, kind of imported from the West, rather than recognizing them as individuals and a grassroots movement for civil rights. Because yeah, the presidential candidate backed by Peace, then Andrzej Duda, said exactly that. As you can see on the screenshot on the left, like the translation of the quote in the title is that they are trying to convince us that this, meaning LGBT, is people, but this is just an ideology. And then he went to compare LGBT rights to communist ideology and noted that this is even more destructive to humans. And peace in general, as you can see on the right, framed the election as almost a civilizational choice between white and red Poland and rainbow Poland. Well, fortunately, he didn't exactly get away with that, with this dehumanization, because it started a wave of demonstrations across the country. This is some of the pictures from a protest in Krakow, where people came to kind of contest exactly that notion. Yeah, the sign on the left says that people are not an ideology, and the sign on the right says that my life is not your electoral slogan. Moving on to the predication strategies, because I see that I'm being a bit too slow. So predication strategies is how others are described, which qualities and features are attributed to them. So on the left, there are some selected quotes, and on the right, I summarize the meanings of the way LGBT have been described. You can see all this kind of negative attributes, which, anti-religious, dangerous child molesters, leftist, anti-Polish, and so on. So presenting them as this threat to Polishness and to traditional values largely, and also as kind of demanding special treatment. And moving, this is maybe building a bit more on the previous point, how this difference between us and them is being constructed, that yes, that this is basically that this is not the Polish culture and this is against Polish culture, so they are not part of the people. And the last biggest point is legitimization strategies. So here I analyzed by which means or which arguments the exclusion of others is legitimized. Same as on an earlier slide. On the left, there are some selected quotes, and on the right, the kind of conclusions from the analysis. So yeah, basically they are counting on the support of this traditionalist parts of the society and mobilizing it, and presenting others as cultural others and as a cultural threat, which is largely the same strategy as it was used in 2015, only like the threat was then not just cultural, but kind of a security threat, but still a threat, endangering Poland, and peace presenting themselves as a protector of the people and of the will of the people, and the Messiah that can save Poland. So to come back to this right-wing populist triad and to put the LGBT discourse in Poland in terms of the theory, kind of who is who. So the pure people are the normal Catholic heterosexual Polish families. The enemy is not so much LGBT people per se, but LGBT ideology, as they say. So meaning different value systems, even modernity and progressiveness as such, and everything that goes against the traditional norm, which goes in line with this Pope Rebel's argument that the rise of populism in Central Eastern Europe is about emergence of neo-traditionalism and rebellion against modernity. And there is one more quote that illustrates that. And yeah, this is this by Prime Minister, that this is the dispute over the world of values. And this was in the quote taken from the context of LGBT discourse prior to the European election. A dispute whether to build modernity on the foundation of tradition, family warmth, or on shocking moral revolutions. Yeah, and kind of, I didn't put it a lot on this in the presentation, but kind of a surprising conclusion for me was that the corrupt elite is, of course, the opposition, but also the EU. And this goes as a as kind of a red thread throughout both LGBT discourse, but also migration discourse. So in this slide, I try to take a bit of the comparative angle and compare findings from this paper to findings with a different paper on migration. Yeah, there are a lot of kind of the same lines, the same even, like they just change the noun, but the argument stayed the same. So in migration discourse, it's sovereign states that must decide. And in LGBT discourse, it's parents that have the right to decide, which is basically a subtle argument for more authoritarianism, maybe even. And this pressure from the European Union, it also is present in both discourses. So yeah, so LGBT ideology as important from the West and imposed from Brussels by Timmermans and so on. And of course, and yeah, the rainbow plague.
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, okay, yeah. So yeah, so the kind of the structure of this right-wing populist triad, it stays the same while the enemies change. And just like enemies can be multiple and both internal as external, the same for the case of Poland, the corrupt elite can also be multiple and both internal and external. So internal would be the political opposition, PO specifically, and external is the EU. There I also have some kind of quotes, they're a bit long, but there's a lot of like demonizing the EU in the discourse and presenting EU and EU competences as a threat to nation sovereignty, which kind of led me to a thought, a hypothesis. I don't know, that that it almost like this anti-migration discourse or anti-LGBT discourse are actually in disguise, they are both anti-EU discourse. That they are using these constructed enemy images of migrants or of LGBT to kind of voice their opposition to the EU or to the values that to the liberal values that the EU is trying to promote, and kind of to mobilize, doing that to mobilize support, like for this counter-hegemonic narrative that they are trying to push in order to gain more say at home, so kind of to also to justify all this authoritarian moves, but also to gain more voice in Brussels, to have a bigger say. But yeah, but this is a point for discussion and for further research that I'm planning to do on, like, to analyze more specifically how peace is othering the EU and how they are framing their discourse about the EU. But yeah, for now, this is it from me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Dziękuję bardzo również.